Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started in just a second, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for
that's fine.
great. Thanks for joining me. This is great. Looks like there's 7 of us, and I've been talking with John Murray, and it seems like most of you showed up for his
Yeah.
as well. He's had 2 so far.
Well, he's had one session in which he delivered 2 consecutive lectures with a short break in between.
Okay. Is he having another one tomorrow?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes,
Right.
he is.
Okay. Well, that's great. Well, my plan, just to let you know, will be probably a lot different than John's. So I'll just give like an 8 to 10 minute mini lecture, and then I'll open it up for dialogue and questions and commentary and thoughts. So it's a bit more like a round table. And so if it goes 25 minutes, that's fine. If it goes 45 minutes, that's fine. But it probably won't go much longer than 45 minutes. I'll probably cut you off a little bit and say we need to wrap it up. So I don't want it to go longer than 5 minutes, just because everybody's busy and it's not ideal to have online lectures and discussions, but it's better than nothing, so we'll do what we can. And when it goes, Liam, I'm going to ask you to mute if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, mother.
Brill. Unmute when you want to talk, though, Liam. Sorry, it's just the feedback there. And so I'll just go ahead and launch into about a 10-minute mini lecture. And then at that point, I'll open it up and I'll let you all know. And if I'm having issues with feedback, I'll let you know to mute if that's okay. I've done Zoom before a few times, and it's usually just fine. But it's good to see all of you, and I'm glad you're able to make it. And yeah, sorry, I'm just looking to see if I can see anybody else. Okay, so today, and again, thanks for coming. Today, we're going to talk about Paul Tillich. And we'll talk just a smidge about David Tracy, but not too much. David Tracy is more contemporary. David Tracy's still alive, actually. But we've been talking about 19th and early 20th century Protestant thought, and it kind of reaches a head in the 20th century, in the mid-20th century. It reaches a head in a kind of rivalry between Paul Tillich and Karl Barth. And Karl Barth is the kind of post-liberal thinker par excellence, in which he wants a strong return to scripture and what you might call a revelation from above, in which we prioritize God over the human. We prioritize the sovereignty of God over the frailty and sinfulness of the human condition. And we can only know God, according to Barth, through God. And then you have that contrasted with the continuation and the full flowering of, I'll just call it that, of the liberal tradition in Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich is still read today. He is not as popular as Karl Barth, but he's not too far behind. He's considered one of the greats of 20th century theology, maybe alongside Karl Barth, Karl Rahner, Hans Urs von Balthasar, Paul Tillich, maybe 1 or 2 others, Bernard Lonergan perhaps. So out of Catholic and Protestant thinkers, Paul Tillich is one of the 5 or 6 main Titan thinkers, if you want to call him that. He's not a minor figure, he would be a major figure. And he's German-born. He lived in Germany, was educated in Germany, left kind of just before World War II got going, and he spent the kind of mature years of his career in the United States, 2 places primarily, Harvard Divinity School and the University of Chicago Divinity School. And that's not a mistake, because both of those are quite famous for being hubs of liberal Protestant thought. The University of Chicago Divinity School might be the best divinity school in the States, even today. It's quite famous for having cutting edge thinkers, for being really diverse. Even today, I think they have something like 7 academic staff that specialize in Islamic theology. Usually folks have 1. They have 7. I mean, that's incredible. They have a massive academic staff there. And Harvard Divinity School is still going strong today. But he was there, Paul Tillich was there in the 1950s, 1960s, just in the heyday of Karl Barth as well. Paul Tillich is principally known for Well, he's known for a lot of different ideas, and his work is too diverse to capture in 5 to 10 minutes. But if I were to leave you with two big takeaways, and perhaps some of this we can discuss or you might have questions about, I hope, is he's known for what's called the correlation method in theology. He's the kind of father of correlationism that David Tracy sort of takes up and champions in the 1980s and 1990s and radicalizes slightly. Okay, and the correlation method might be what you call the heart of liberal thought in the Protestant world, and actually in the Catholic world. David Tracy's Catholic, just so you know. He's a Catholic priest, and David Tracy taught at the University of Chicago for 40 years and retired about 10 years ago, and he's still around. And David Tracy is kind of the heir of Paul Tillich at the University of Chicago. But the correlation method is one, and number two would be the idea of sin as estrangement, and us feeling estranged. Sorry, make sure this is not my 3-year-old. Oh, hey, Jack, I'm giving a lecture. I'll come out in a minute, I promise. Right here, you can see my students. No, I have to. Come on. Here. Yeah, I'll be on in a few minutes. Thanks. Sorry, I thought I would escape that.
You should have let him stay in.
He hears me lecture enough.
He might learn a bit.
Yeah.
Those are great match attacks. I'll look at them after, I promise. All right, those three. All right, now go. I'll play soccer with you after, I promise. Sorry, guys, 1 second.
No problem.
All right, I'll pick that one,
You're good, Joe.
that one, that one. All right, say a quick hi and then go.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi there, how you going?
He's got long hair, but it's a boy, I promise.
Oh yeah. I think so. I think I've seen that guy in football gear, have I?
Yes, he's got it on right now. Home
All
football.
right, yeah. Great.
Hey, well done.
I've been coaching him every day for 30 minutes in soccer.
All right.
And these are his match attacks cards, soccer player.
Oh, match attack, yeah.
Very good.
Yeah. All right, Jack, can I finish up? I'm almost done with Paul Tillich. Do you want me to, you want to hear?
We'll see you later, Jack.
See you, Jack.
All right, you sit in the back and be quiet.
Okay, I'll sit right here.
I have another member here. No, you can't. No, you can sit in the. No, sit there, please.
Okay.
All right. Have to be.
Come on, Jack.
All right. So Paul Tillich, to continue, is the correlation method. Let me just go through that, and then I'll finish with what he thinks kind of estrangement is, and how that's an existential interpretation of sin. So Paul Tillich, though, this makes sense once I go through the correlation method, wants to say that theology, for it to stay relevant and fresh and actually alive at all, he says it'd be a dead discipline otherwise, is it must correlate with culture. Here's culture, here's theology, and it must match or correlate with it. It must learn from it. What he actually says is theology must answer the questions that culture asks. So it always stays relevant by addressing whatever contemporary culture's questions are of the day. Whatever is urgent for culture, that's what theology is trying to meet. And that's how theology stays alive. It correlates, and that means theology is not timeless. That means theology is not static, but it's always on the move. It's always in need of more publications, fresh takes, fresh interpretations. It's a kind of endless interpretive task in which theology is regularly retrieved in light of the shifting sands of contemporary late modern culture. Now, Tillich, though, says typically philosophy is the best discipline theology can correlate with, because philosophy usually gives the pulse of the day. And Tillich's work is ever more relevant because Tillich thinks the best diagnostic philosophy of the day is existentialism. And it was wildly popular. It still is, but it was wildly popular. Back up, Jack. Wildly popular in the 1930s, all the way through, you could say, the 60s. And it kind of went underground and it became almost professionalized in philosophy departments and lost its kind of radical prophetic edge. Does anybody know the founding text of existentialism in the 20th century? It's probably the most important philosophical text of the 20th century, at least a top 5 text. A German thinker. It's all these Germans. Something's in the water. It's a German philosopher named Martin Heidegger. H-E-I-D, Heidegger, E-G-G-E-R, Heidegger. He was at similar universities like Marburg and Freiburg that Tillich and some of these, like Rudolf Bultmann, a New Testament scholar, some of these theologians were at. But Heidegger wrote a work in 1927 called Being and Time. It's a brilliant text. It's hugely important. Totally made him internationally famous overnight. Completely reshaped French philosophy from the 1940s after World War II on. There are commentaries on Being in Time, still published today. It's very popular in the English-speaking world. It's deeply influenced by theology as well. It's a fascinating text. But a crash course on Being in Time is the following in 30 seconds. Okay, Heidegger says, it's a 400-page book. I dare you to read it sometime. And you have to read it very slowly. It's not unclear, it's just dense. You read like 8 pages at a time in one day, maybe 5. Don't read more than that. But Heidegger will say, in his very Heideggerian way, his very overwrought prose, that we are thrown into the world. Nobody asked you or me if we wanted to be born. Okay? We were just what he calls Geworfenheit. We have a feeling of being thrown or thrownness, being tossed literally into the world. Okay? And he says our thrownness in the world without being consulted means that we have a kind of unease, almost a feeling of not being at home, what he calls uncanniness. And we often don't know what to do with that. And we also know that we've been thrown into the world and that we die. And so we know we're finite creatures thrown into the world. And we have what he calls a fundamental angst about that because we don't want to confront our death. That's difficult. So we indulge in escaping from our death and our thrownness by what he calls idle chatter. So we talk about death. We talk about how other people die, but we don't really live in and through our own death. So he calls this a fundamental angst. And he says this is different than fear. Fear is being scared or even anxious about a particular object, say an oncoming car that's going to hit me. I'm afraid of that. And so I move out of the way. Angst for Heidegger is angst about our very being in the world. Dasein is what he says it. Being in the world with dashes. It's all one word, being in the world. And so our very angst about our very existence itself leads to a feeling of not being at home, which leads to us wanting to escape that feeling. And we do that through what he calls being inauthentic. We don't confront our own finitude, our own mortality, our own death. And the way to be authentic is to, what Heidegger says, live toward death or being toward death. And he doesn't mean physical death at this point. He says we should understand death existentially as the possibility of impossibility. And we need to seize possibilities as if they're impossible the next minute. So that means not resting on our laurels, but living towards the future, maximizing our possibilities, projecting new possibilities, and not living paralyzed by angst, basically. And so that's essentially what Being in Time is trying to say. It's a fascinating text that reverberates in the theology and philosophy, and Heidegger's drawing on Luther, St. Paul, Augustine, and Heidegger's got a lot on time, past, future, present, and how temporality is really important. That's why it's called Being in Time.
Daddy,
Yeah, really quickly.
look at this and this.
Yeah, he's a really good goalkeeper. I agree.
Look at him.
I'm fleeing from my death right now. Sorry.
93 and 60.
That's
He's
great.
better than me.
Okay, hold on. I promise I'll give you my attention in a minute.
I was going on a whitey. Annie Cassidy is.
It's okay. Hold on. Someone's joining, I think.
Garrod.
Can you see the screen like I can?
Yeah, it says please click open Zoom meetings if you see this.
Yeah, I think Gerard is sharing his screen, which
Thank you for
stop
sharing your
sharing,
screen,
Gerard.
Gerard. Anyway, I'll just finish up with this because I don't want to go too much longer. Is that Tillich will say that Christianity can correlate with the existentialism, something like the existentialism of Heidegger. If we baptize or theologize according to the vocabulary of Heidegger, we can see sin as a feeling of not being at home with oneself in the world, as being estranged from oneself and from God. And that redemption is not so much about paying for our sins or atoning for our sins as it is with healing that feeling of angst. And Tillich completely, fundamentally reworks and redefines from the ground up, existentially, every major Christian doctrine you can think of. And he does it in a 3-volume work on systematic theology written in the 50s. And he said it about killed him to write it. And it was very painful for him to finish it towards the end of his career in the 1950s when he was at the University of Chicago. But he did it. And they're not very long. They'll be different than Barth. He's not as wordy as Barth. So 3 thin volumes. But he works on sin and Christology and a lot of the language we stop there.
So what's Christology?
I'll talk to you after. I promise I'll explain to you Christology. Jack likes to talk about the Trinity a lot too, by the way. Yeah,
Oh boy.
over that. Now it's Christology. So Christology, though, for Tillich is principally, well, it's hard to explain. He's kind of difficult unless we just sit down and read him together. But he does use ideas of symbolism. Jack, that's loud, so can you please stop? As if Christ is a symbol rather than a historical person, and an existential symbol that can liberate me from my self-estrangement and my angst. And so what you get is a radical existential interpretation of Christianity that is a perfect expression of correlationism, in which Christianity correlates. Please stop, Jack.
Do it anymore.
All right, just pick it up, son.
Okay, I picked it up.
Very good. Put it in your pocket. Okay. So that's, I have slides on Tillich, and they're kind of all over the place. And it's hard to, just like Barth, it's hard to grasp Tillich unless you're reading Tillich carefully along with him. A kind of updated Tillich would be David Tracy's book, The Analogical Imagination, Christian Theology and the Culture of Pluralism, which was published the year I was born, 1981, actually, so it's fairly old. But David Tracy's book still has a fresh feel to it. People love David Tracy because he's a kind of liberal Catholic. He's a very generous reader of everybody. He's optimistic. He's written some other books since, but David Tracy hasn't published anything substantial in 20 years probably. But David Tracy's book, The Analogical Imagination, is a very important landmark for 1980s, kind of the last gasp of liberal theology in the 80s is David Tracy's book. And then we enter into the post-liberal age with George Lindbeck, which I'll talk about next week, I hope. So that's kind of where we're at with Protestant theology. If some of that makes sense, correlation method, existentialism, Tillich. We could keep talking about Barth as well, but I'll just throw it open for any questions or thoughts. If these are theologians, Jack. If you have any thoughts.
What's alibizologic? What's it?
Theologians, that's a compliment.
Yeah.
It was nice to have that phrase existential angst put in context, because I'd come across that before, didn't quite know where it came from, but clearly it has its roots in Tillich. And it's also very apparent why Barth wouldn't like him very much, or at least wouldn't agree with him very much. It's very human-centered.
Yes,
perspective.
exactly.
You know, the human dilemma without, a certain explanation, a certain and sure explanation being offered to the dilemma that we live in. So in a way, he's much more open and questioning, at least as you described it there, Joseph.
Yeah, he would be a kind of sophisticated, updated liberal thinker of the 19th century, where he's open. He's liberal in the sense that he's interested in questioning his own tradition and reinterpreting it if need be, updating the tradition rather than simply restating it.
Yeah.
Might lead him to some radical critiques of traditional orthodoxy, and I think Tillich is okay with that. Surprisingly, Tillich is more traditional in his theology, at least surprising to me every time I read him. He has a reputation of being really radical, crazy a bit, and then when you read him, you're like, oh, he's not that radical. A little bit of a overblown, liberal label that's attached to him. It's not a and it's hard to know what liberal means, so that's in part what we're problematizing. But I agree with you. The basic distinction between Barth and Tillich is Barth is God-centered. Revelation from God is how we know God. Whereas revelation kind of comes up in and through the human condition with Tillich and Tracy and Lonergan and Ronner, many of the kind of great liberal thinkers, all the way from Schleiermacher to the present. The word angst comes from Heidegger, really, but it can be traced back to Kierkegaard in the 1830s, 40s, and even 2 Thessalonians in the New Testament, where Paul talks about believers being anxious about the second return of Christ, and don't be anxious. Heidegger actually says we can see that kind of angst all the way back in the New Testament. So the idea of angst has its roots in theological texts and thinkers like Kierkegaard, even Luther, when Luther was anxious about sin and how can grace liberate me from that. It's a fascinating genealogy you could carry out with that whole concept and category of angst. Yeah, thanks for the question. Anybody else? Thoughts or questions?
Just
Yeah,
quickly,
go ahead, Port.
just when you were talking about Heidegger there, he's more, I would have always associated his thinking more with phenomenology, and
Yeah.
just wondering about the connection between that kind of philosophy of angst and phenomenology. Is there any kind of link, or is there a
Yeah, so Heidegger was a phenomenologist. He was a student of Edmund Husserl.
Yeah.
He was a research assistant of Edmund Husserl as well, edited some of Husserl's works. Husserl is the founder and father of phenomenology. Now, Heidegger is a great critic of Husserl and takes phenomenology in a totally different direction. There's almost like two phenomenologies. There's the phenomenology of after Husserl, which is much more Kantian and Cartesian. And then there's the existential phenomenology of Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre and Merleau-Ponty. And it's a much more interested in saying that we don't have an ego, we don't have an essence as a subject. We're just cast into the world, and we project our possibilities, and we create ourselves as we go. Whereas we say we already have a self, we're grounded in what he calls a transcendental ego that constitutes the world.
Yeah.
Heidegger will say we're already in the world immersed. So he's giving a phenomenology of mood and angst and morality in a way that Husserl is not, but he would still consider it a phenomenological project. And if you read Being in Time, the first 30 pages is his definition of phenomenology and how he is using phenomenology to understand what he calls being in the world, or existence.
Yeah.
Calls it. But it is a phenomenological, it's in the phenomenological canon. And the canon of phenomenology is very diverse. You got Husserl and Heidegger as kind of founding fathers, and then you have French thinkers that go in different directions from those two. And but yeah, it's still, phenomenology is very simple. It's just the study of how things manifest themselves, or phenomenon in Greek is just appearance or revelation.
Yeah.
So that's what Heidegger's trying to do. He's trying to understand how the human condition is manifest in and through angst, basically.
Yeah.
And that's what leads him. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that he seems to have influenced other thinkers a lot, like Levinas would, as far as I can remember, would have been very influenced by his phenomenology.
Yeah.
This
He's a
notion
phenomenologist.
Yeah.
So Totality and Infinity, written in 1903, is a major work in the canon of phenomenology. One of the great French phenomenologists who is equally influenced by Husserl and Heidegger. So Levinas translated Husserl into French, wrote a book on Husserl, but I think was more influenced by Heidegger. But he also said he could never forgive Heidegger because Heidegger had certain associations with the Nazi Party.
That's right, yeah.
The Nazi Party.
I'll explain to you a very big one. I'll explain that one. That takes a long time to explain.
What is the Nazi Party?
It's a political party. I promise I'll
What's
get to it.
political?
Politics, like the president.
What do you mean he can never
100
forgive
questions
him?
here. One second. I
Never
promise, Jack, I will get to you. You are amazing with
Wait,
your
this is just one
curiosity.
question. This is just one.
One question.
Why is Annie Cassidy?
Anya Cassidy is one of my students. She's right there.
Yeah, but what is that red thing on
It
it?
just says a microphone and it's got a slash through that says that she's muted herself, so I can't hear her.
Why?
Well, in case there's noise in her house, it won't interrupt us. Okay?
How Liam O'Reilly do?
Liam O'Reilly has his camera blanked, so we can't see him because it's affecting the noise. Okay?
Well, how?
Write down your questions and then I'll address them all, I promise.
I don't know how.
Here, put that puzzle together. I don't think you can do that. There's no way you can do that.
This is too easy.
So Levinas, totality and infinity, is also part of the tradition of phenomenology.
Yeah.
But he's critiquing Heidegger by saying Heidegger's too neutral and we need to reinsert ethics and respect for the other. And again,
Yeah.
phenomenology in his own idiosyncratic direction is brilliant, but he's inspired by Husserl and Heidegger. Phenomenology is almost like a style of thinking
Yeah.
or an inspiration, something like that. And then and the taxonomy of phenomenology goes in a dozen different directions.
Yeah.
I write on sometimes Michel Henry is a phenomenologist who's deeply influenced by Husserl and by Heidegger. It's almost like there's three waves of French phenomenology. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote Being and Nothingness in 1945, just after he was liberated. And it's basically a poor man's Heidegger. It's a poor man's Being in Time. It's brilliant, brilliant too. And then you have Levinas and Merleau-Ponty, and then you have Derrida was a phenomenologist who wrote a book, Husserl, translated Husserl. So you have a lot of French thinkers, thank you. You have a lot of French thinkers deeply influenced by Heidegger and Husserl that are in the philosophical tradition. But in the theological tradition, you have Tillich and Rahner, both deeply influenced by Heidegger. You also have Lonergan a little bit, but I would say the big two are Rahner. And Rahner sat in on classes of Heidegger, and early work is deeply existential.
Yeah.
Very much a theological restatement of Being in Time almost.
Yeah.
Could make that argument. So Heidegger is worth reading if you're interested in
Yeah.
20th century philosophy, 20th century theology, modern theology. I would say, Heidegger is important. Somebody chats from Liam. Sorry, let me see here. Might be a question. Liam says, I find existential angst to be an interesting concept, that our creation is a joy to God in Christian context, and yet our existence, from our perspective, leaves a feeling of being thrown in, and the anxiety of our mortality is interesting. So could an essay on how theologians deal with the question of existentialism be an essay, like using Being in Time as a key source among others? Yeah, you could write on angst. You could write on the early Rahner, which I have a PDF of that book. It's complicated though. You could write on Tillich, and Tillich is using Heidegger. So if some of this interests you, you could write on Tillich, and I can help you focus on a particular text. I would say probably volume 1 or volume 2 of his systematic theology, which we have. I know it's there because I checked it last year. Although that might be hard given the circumstances, actually. Anyway, so yeah, Liam, I think that's a good question. Heidegger has a book from the 20s before Being in Time called The Phenomenology of Religious Life, where it shows his notes on Augustine's book 10 in the Confessions and the New Testament texts, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. You could write on something on Heidegger's understanding of St. Paul. There's been a lot of literature on that too, because it's interesting how his literature on St. Paul has been so influential. So that's a possible topic if some of this interests you. Thanks for that, Liam. Any other thoughts or questions?
Just something, just something. Your questioner there asking about the Nazis. You know, doing a lot of reading during the week of the stuff that you have on Loop, Joseph, and just went through that Barman Declaration in
Oh yeah, brilliant.
in detail, and you know, it's a very brave document for its time,
Extremely.
considering that, you know, Hitler had more or less nationalized the church and decided that it was now the National Socialist Church, and everybody needed to get with the plan. And most, well, many seemed to do so.
Yeah,
Many.
he's here. He's here. He's giving me a lecture, kind of.
Sorry to bother you.
No problem.
No, but if you could take him, that might be helpful, because he keeps asking about match attacks cards and Nazism.
Okay.
I promise. I'm almost done.
Cards if you don't talk about
I really want to ask my dad one more
them.
question.
Jackie, he's working.
That's all right.
In fairness, he did ask some theological questions also. So.
What's
You surely
Christology?
did.
That's what I used to know.
Okay, I'll talk to you about that. Come on.
I just like.
Jack.
Do you want the match text cards? Then out of the room.
Okay, now I get what I said.
All right. I'm been
Oh, yes.
thanks
There's,
to
there's someone who understands negotiation.
exactly.
But I think the point I wanted to make really was that, you know, Barth, for me anyway, is becoming a much less, I guess, you know, dour and forbidding character, and much more human the more you read about him and read him. And I really think that that Barman Declaration and the leadership that he showed at that time, when Christ, I mean, they didn't know the full horror of what was going to unfold, but it must have been a very scary time in Germany, with things being abolished left, right, and center, and this kind of Nazi tyranny just really beginning to clamp down. And he stands up and he says, "No, don't mess with God while you're at this carry on." It was very brave.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also shows the difficult dilemma I think most churches in Europe and North America face, where they're at home, where they've been kind of enculturated and deeply interwoven within cultures. A lot of churches like power. They like institutional power. And that's not always a critique, because institutional power is not evil in itself. But I think the church, it's easy for it to lose its kind of countercultural, to put it very simply, its kind of sense of wanting to be on the margins and stay there. And so a lot of the churches, I don't think, were supporters of Hitler, but I think they were keen to maintain, and they had no idea what was coming, I'm sure, keen to maintain their position of cultural dominance and power and institutional support. There's probably financial implications involved. And so I think what Barth was doing is he was thinking less like a churchman and more like a theologian, and just saying, like, this is the lack of integrity theologically here is important. But I agree with you, the amount of courage it took. I wrote a paper on the Barman Declaration when I was an undergraduate. In my fourth year, I wrote an honors thesis, maybe, I don't know, 8,000, it wasn't very long. But it's a great paper for anybody here to write on, especially if you're interested in history, like church history or kind of World War II history and theology, like Bonhoeffer and Barth and Barman Declaration. And I remember having a lot of fun with that paper. I remember writing a religion thesis on Barth, and then a history thesis, a small thesis on the Barman Declaration. I was really into Barth for a while, but I enjoyed the Barman Declaration because it opens up a whole context of what was going on in the 1930s and 40s with the church in Europe, how scary it was. Yeah, thanks for that comment. I appreciate it, Tony. Any other thoughts or comments in the next 10, maybe 10 more minutes max if we want to go? Here.
Just a question, if I could be permitted to follow on.
Please.
I'm still doing a little bit on this April 2nd presentation, which was going to be on Barth and the analogy of being.
Yeah.
So I'll have slides on that, and I'm just wondering, in this Loop context now, in this Zoom context.
Yeah, do you want to give a presentation here?
Could we do that next week,
Yeah.
I think?
Yeah, if you want to do it. Look, why don't we do that, Tony? I'm happy to send out a link and we could do the same time Wednesday at 3, if that's okay.
Okay.
Folks.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'll let
sounds
you
okay.
present if you keep it, 10 or 15 minutes. I also have another set of lecture slides and a brief video from a guest lecturer. He sent them to me just about an hour ago. So I'll send those out to you next week as well, so you can have a look at those. And he was going to talk about Rowan Williams,
Oh, yeah.
the kind of famous Anglican theologian, another angle of entry into the world of Protestant thought. So why don't we do that next week? We'll have the guest lecturer's brief video and slides. And then Tony, if you want to put the material on Zoom, that's a great idea. And
Well, I'll upload it in Loop, and then I think now it should be possible to share a screen and then talk over the slides.
and when, you can put your slides up on the
format.
screen and
Yeah.
in slide presentation mode if you want to do that. That's
Yeah.
if you're comfortable with doing that, that'd be great. Yeah.
We'll give it a go, and then you can take a few pot shots at it.
No, it's good because I think we'll take a few pot shots at Bart, because Bart's rejection of the analogy of being, I think, is hasty. So hopefully that will come out. That's my opinion anyway.
Yeah.
Look, if there aren't any more questions or thoughts, can I just thank you for showing up? I think it's great under these circumstances. We're able to get together and talk theology and talk shop. That's great. Even with my 8-year-old in tow. I appreciate patience. And I'll send out this video as well. I think this has been recorded. So I'll send this out and see if I can organize the Loop page a little bit better, so you'll hear from me again through Loop. And we'll see you next Wednesday at,
That's it, right.
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock, and I'll get a link sent out next week, so I won't send it out too early. Looks like there's a new message. Liam says, thank you. Ricky is just coming late, I think. Sorry, Ricky. Okay, thanks everybody.
Okay, thanks, Joe.
Okay, thanks, Pork. Thanks, Ani.
Very
Thanks,
much.
Liam.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
See you
Thanks,
tomorrow
Carl.
night, everyone else.
What's that?
See you tomorrow night. I'll see
Tomorrow
everyone
night.
else.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Almost
enjoy.
anyway. Yeah.
Okay, cheers.
Good luck,
Cheers, guys.
Joseph. Good
Bye,
luck,
bye, bye.
everybody.